I'm Dave Samelson, Superintendent of the Great Northern District for the next 8 days. And then, if Blake would stand up, Blake Busick. Now I want you to know something, Blake and I were born about 2 months apart, and we look so much alike that people confuse us all the time. It's been happening constantly, yeah. So that's Blake. Great Northern District is a huge district, huge, with 102 mostly small, scrappy churches. Our annual conference is unbelievably diverse. Diverse geographically, diverse theologically, diverse politically, diverse ethnically. The Great Northern District is mostly rural and with a lot of mostly small, scrappy churches. I want to tell a couple stories. Go to the next slide. Red Bluff United Methodist Church, located in the North Sacramento Valley. Go to the next slide. 1962, a very beautiful sanctuary, very innovative design was built. However, there was one major problem. It was structurally flawed. And about 25 years ago, the roof began to sag more and more and more. They eventually had to put up supports to prevent it from collapsing. And then about 6 years ago, it was condemned. Now, the problem was you can't get insurance money to tear down a church. If a church burns down, you get insurance money, but to tear down a church, and it was going to cost over $300,000 just to tear it down. The church of about 50 didn't have $300,000 to tear it down. They thought it would cost way over $1 million to rebuild. They didn't have those sorts of resources. But they got a new pastor, Reverend Scott Gesford, and an incredibly tenacious trustee chair named Ben Hughes. And they began to think and dream and scale down and find ways of being scrappy. Go to the next slide. They found a local contractor. Ben Hughes found a local contractor who builds steel buildings and said, you know what? I can put a new roof over the entire structure for $300,000. Well, that's still too much money. They didn't have $300,000. So they began to work with Don Jones, our incredible conference unit insurance person. And working with them, we have a resource that some of you may not know about, and that is, in many situations, churches can receive funds to bring a building up to code. And Don Jones Insurance provided over $350,000. Go to the next slide. So that old, rotting roof came off. Go to the next slide. And they began to build. For a while, they were the topless church. That's right. And it has come together. And 2 weeks ago, one more slide. 2 weeks ago, I was privileged to be there, standing next to that wonderful trustee, tenacious trustee chair, Ben Hughes, and Scott is next to him as we dedicated that building. Now, you notice the flooring's not quite in. They're still working on that. They're still, in fact, if you have some funds for mission, the Red Bluff Church would be a wonderful place for missional funds. Go to the next slide. Portola United Methodist Church is located high up in the Sierras. 2 years ago, there was a heavy winter. Go to the next slide. Beautiful, isn't it? One more slide. Snow is beautiful, but snow is heavy. And that heavy snow resulted in, one more slide. Yeah, almost every truss beam in the fellowship hall cracked. And what they had to do was they had to put up posts. Literally, the room was immediately condemned. They had to put up posts so the whole thing just didn't collapse down. And then they began working with Don Jones Insurance. And they found out they were going to get about $220,000, and that wasn't quite enough. And the pastor, Becky Stockdale, began to talk with contractors and work with local people to find a way to get it done for much less than they thought it was going to cost. And they worked together, and they received about $225,000 from insurance, and they raised another $25,000. Go to the next slide. And work began. New trusses. Next slide. One more. Yeah, there's the new roof going in. One more. And there it is, complete. Now, a couple really cool things about this. 5,000 of that 25,000 came from their sister church in Quincy, about 30 miles down the road. Isn't that neat? Yeah. 30 years ago, Quincy had a fire, and they needed help, and other churches gave to them, and this was their chance to give back to our connection. And they were joyous in their giving. Go to the next slide. Here's something else really neat. That's members of Becky's family, and they took some of that wood from the social hall, and they crafted it into a beautiful new altar. One more slide. There it is. And so that new altar, where the old, the legacy of the past meets the hope of the future, all there at Portola United Methodist Church. Go to the next slide. Last thing I want to talk about is resources and giving. In 2012, 6 years ago, the entire Great Northern District, all the churches collectively, contributed $694,000. In 2016, they broke the $800,000 barrier, and this last year, those 102, mostly small churches, contributed $822,000. Go to the next slide. That's an increase, and these are annually this amount. So it's not an increase over the whole 6 years, but every year, currently $127,737 more than they gave 6 years ago. Yeah, and they're doing that again this year. Now, that's an 18.4% increase. Now that's impressive. Go to the next slide. Now, it's tough business being the church. As Stacy talked about, we all want to see growth, and yet the reality is it doesn't always happen, does it? In addition, sometimes you can grow in your worship attendance, and old, long-time faithful givers pass away, and new folks come, and the new folks don't give at the same rate that the old folks did. And over that time, overall giving dropped a little bit. Not a lot, 1.74%, but that 1.74% is $193,000. Go to the next slide. So this is what happened. Over the last 6 years, and this is annually now, an increase of $127,000 given to our connection, being faithful, because that's what we're about, being connected, working together, while revenue went down $193,000. How can that be? How can you give that much more when a little bit less came in? Go to the next slide. In 1973, one of the great economic treatises ever written, E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. The subtitle is Economics as If People Mattered. Schumacher talked about growth for the sake of growth, and we are in a culture of giganticism, where the idea that the biggest is the only thing that matters. And this was an idea, a rejection of growth at any cost, placing people first, focusing on community and doing things locally whenever possible, focusing on economic sustainability, and focusing on ecological sustainability. You don't necessarily need to build huge structures when smaller structures will suffice. Over the last 6 years, well over half of the churches of the Great Northern District have done things consistent with this idea of not always necessarily growing in size, although many have grown, but finding ways to be scrappy. I want to lift up 5 things that have happened. One, many churches have right-sized compensation. We generally do this when there's a pastoral change. We don't usually do it in the middle of a pastorate, but when there's a change. And here's where the compensation package is, and here's what the church can afford, and we right-size it. And we have the flexibility to do that. A second thing is, many churches have reduced health care costs, but not quality, through use of the state exchange or Obamacare. Again, this is not a punishing. This is scrappiness. In 8 days, I will move on to the state exchange. And for my family of 3, we'll have very similar coverage through Kaiser. And the cost of the church will be $23,283 less every year because of that change. Number 3, churches have become entrepreneurial. looking at ways to partner in the community with schools, nonprofits, sharing facilities, often to provide resources to make things happen. Number 4, there's been a creative use of resources. Sometimes churches have significant gifts, reserves, and endowments. And the idea of just grabbing those chunk by chunk just tears at a church. But many churches have taken those funds, invested those, and what we often call the foundation model of receiving 5% of those funds every year, which goes into the general fund. That's right, you can do that. And 4, the use of volunteers whenever possible. Vim projects, do it yourself, scrappiness. Go to the next slide. At the same time that this has happened, there's been another trend. And this is not just in Great Northern District, this is throughout our connection. There's been an increase in local missional ministry, in food banks, in community meals, in homeless ministries, in reentry ministries for ex-offenders. Small can be very beautiful. Go to the next slide. So the Great Northern District is a huge district with lots of small, scrappy churches. Churches that have learned that small can be very beautiful. Thank you.